The content of this video may be disturbing or frightening to some viewers. Discretion is advised. These stories are found on Reddit's Are No Sleep subreddit.
My older sister's plane crashed 4 years ago. Today, they came back to us. They found her. Phelan was 17 when she disappeared. I said goodbye to my sister a long time ago, so hearing that the doomed students of Flight 106 were found alive, the first thing I did was run upstairs and heave up my breakfast. The school informed parents that their children would meet them off a private jet. I stood with Mom, trembling. I had no idea how to tell her how lonely I had been and how much I resented her. Zach Chase stepped off of the jet. He was the golden boy who was destined for great things. I barely recognized him. Zach had filthy, overgrown dark brown curls, and tatters of clothing still clung to his skeletal frame. The tattoos on his back and shoulders caught my eye. What really stood out was the crown of entangled vine and animal bone nestled on his curls. Zach was grinning, but his eyes were hollowed out. I watched him hug his parents, still wearing that unnerving smile. Annalise, all of her blonde hair shaved off, smiling. Peter, smiling. He pulled off his flower crown, crumpling in his mother's arms. Finally. Mom screamed my sister's name, and there she was, stumbling towards us. Phelan was wrapping her arms around me, and she was so small, so brittle, like a leaf. Her clothes were glued to her, wet, dry, stained, and stinking of everything I didn't want to think of. Her hair had grown to her stomach, braided and entangled with flowers, just like the others. I didn't realize I was sobbing until I heard myself. When Phelan tried to pull away, I tightened my grip, squeezing her to my chest. "Don't leave me again," I sobbed. "I'm home, Eris," she whispered. "I did everything I could to come back." She plucked off her crown of bone and placed it on top of my head. She was so... Phelan. Even when my sister tried to hide the hollow parts of her, the bloody gashes under her shirt and a line of stitches across her neck, she wore that odd smile. "Can we get McDonald's, Mom?" Phelan ate 12 burgers, then a whole bottle of soda in one gulp. She was eating everything. Every morsel in our kitchen she stuffed into her mouth. The sheriff's son revealed some pretty confusing information from his dad. "Do you know the island those kids were on?" he said. "My dad isn't completely sure it's real, but there are bite marks everywhere. And I don't just mean physical things. Dad said somehow half of the island is missing." The boy shivered. "The sea, for example. There's a huge chunk taken out of it. The entire stretches of land and air have been eaten away." Mom got the call 3 days after Phelan got home. "Eris!" Mom screamed my name. Phelan stood in the doorway, her mouth opening wider, and wider, and wider, and wider. My brother went missing 30 years ago. I just found him in my basement. When someone you love disappears, it messes with your entire life. For me, it was my 13-year-old brother David. I loved my older brother so much. We lived in a small farm town in the Pennsylvania countryside, in one of the oldest houses in town, built sometime in the late 1700s. On the night he went missing, I remember my parents weren't home that night for whatever reason, but back in the 80s, it was considered okay to leave your kids home alone. My brother and I sat on the floor in the living room listening to a radio broadcast. My brother asked me to fill him a glass of Hawaiian punch. After I went to the kitchen and poured him a glass, he had vanished entirely from the living room. I remember that exact moment as clear as day. I thought he was playing a trick on me. I played along, but when I searched every room in that damn house, not a hair was out of place. He couldn't have gone outside because I was by the front door the whole time, and the previous owner sealed the window shut. The basement door in the living room was wide open. the only place he could have gone. When I left to fill up his drink, it was shut. I was horrified of the basement as a kid because there was no electricity down there, and it looked like a dungeon. I yelled his name countless times from the top of the stairs, but he never answered. Even though I was 11, that basement still scared me. I remember that night sobbing uncontrollably, and when my parents finally pulled into the driveway the following day, I was still in tears when I told them about David. Mom and Dad checked the whole house. I then told Dad about how the door was wide open when he walked down into the basement. I remember sitting on the couch next to the basement door hoping my dad would walk back up with David. But when Dad walked up those stairs, his face had gone ashen. In his hands were my brother's clothes from the night before. I can't describe how horrified I was. He dropped them onto the ground and walked upstairs to where Mom was. I then got on the ground and crawled toward the clothes. Exactly what my brother was wearing before he disappeared. I sorted through them. He wore a shirt, pants, underwear, and socks that night. Everything was stripped from him. I could hear my parents' voices from upstairs. My mother then came sprinting down the stairs and got on the phone with the police. My dad ran outside and into the field. When the police finally arrived, the entire police team thought he must have gone outside and got lost in the nearby forest. But I knew he was in that house. The police officers spent weeks searching the woods and fields near our house. The police checked the basement but said there was nothing. They closed the case about half a year later. The entire town assumed it was a kidnapping. I knew it had something to do with that basement, but I could never get myself down there. After his disappearance, life continued for our family. We turned David's bedroom into a guest bedroom. I hated how my parents did that. It felt like they were trying to move on. I was unable to. Losing David was a huge damper on my entire family, something that would hang over our heads our whole lives. Mom's way of coping with the grief was erasing all memory of him. I wouldn't say I liked her guts for that. Every time I looked at that basement door growing up, I could feel something behind it. One day, when I was 16, I was putting DVDs away in the living room. Sitting a few feet away from that door, I smelt something familiar. The smell was seeping through the cracks of the door. It was what my brother smelled like. I got up and nearly ripped that door off the hinges. I ran downstairs into the darkness. The entire room smelt like David's old bedroom. It was pitch black, but I knew he was in there. I started screaming his name. I screamed his name for hours until Dad finally came down. Dad couldn't smell it. He thought I was insane. I remember I couldn't talk for weeks after that. Nowadays, the 30th anniversary of David's disappearance is rolling around. I can say it's been a long 30 years without him. I live alone an hour or so away from my childhood town. I had to leave there as soon as possible. When I turned 18, I started looking toward apartments in town, and by my 20th birthday, I was out the door. My parents continued to live in that house. My mom developed stage 3 breast cancer about 3 years ago and was forced into a group home closer to the hospital. My father was allowed to move with her and sell the home, but he decided to stay there and continue farming. My mother and father had a challenging relationship since I left the house, so Dad didn't mind the quiet. Later on, my dad fell off his tractor and broke his knee, and he is now unable to walk without a cane. He then moved in with Mom, sold me the land for free, and insisted I return to that house. I wanted nothing to do with that house. I had to pay taxes for that house on top of my taxes. I then allowed tenants to move in. They were a young couple in their late 20s. Of course, my stubborn old man was angry with me for letting a desperate couple live in the vacant house. They've been living in that house for almost a year now, and they called me last week to complain about a decaying smell coming from the basement. By that time, I had learned to adapt to David's death. I told them I'd check it out the following day. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I woke up early the following day and drove to the house. It felt odd driving back there. Those fields all felt so familiar. I tried not to think about how scared I was of that basement growing up. Fortunately, my dad finally added electricity to the basement. I pulled into the driveway. They were both waiting outside for me. They said it smelt like something was rotting down there. I had everything I'd need: Asbestos masks, medical gloves, eye protection. I worked as an air duct cleaner a few years ago and have some background knowledge. I walked into the house and headed for the basement door. I have never seen what it looked like down there. I opened the door and immediately smelled it. Something was rotting there. I turned on the light switch. Ahead of me was an empty room. It was small. It looked to be about 15 by 10 feet big. This basement had haunted me all these years. Seeing it with the lights on felt off. The walls were stone except for one. One of the walls stood out. It was made of wood instead of stone. The smell was coming from the wood. The wood was rotting. I walked over and thought the best idea would be to tear down the whole wall. I started tearing pieces of rotten wood off the walls. Light began to seep into the other side. There was a secret room in the basement. I stopped and saw what looked like human flesh before me. I couldn't describe how horrified I was. I would rather go to hell than relive that terrible moment. I started smashing that wall with all the force in my body until it finally gave in. The creature in front of me, just the sight of it, made me want to claw my eyes out. It was in a fetal position. The skin wasn't pale, it was white and looked like the flesh had been melted to the bones. The fingernails and toenails stretched halfway across the room. The worst part was that it wasn't dead. It was breathing. It was alive. "David," I said in a terrified voice. It slowly lifted its head and looked at me. The face looked mutated entirely, but those eyes were my brother's eyes. It tried to speak. It tried with everything in it. That thing was my brother David. I had so many questions. How was he alive? What did he eat? How could he breathe? What the fuck happened? I kept the questions to myself. That was my brother in that basement. This whole time he's been in that fucking basement. I didn't say another word to him. I ran upstairs and out to my car. I opened up my glove box and grabbed my gun. By the time I got downstairs, David had stood up. I was dragging his long nails behind him. "Julian," he growled. I then shot him in the head. At the top of the stairs were the tenants questioning the gunshot. They walked down the stairs to investigate. When I heard them scream, I was already out the door and back out of their driveway. I didn't shoot David because I was scared of him. I hit him because I saw how awful the situation was. That was 2 days ago. I've been driving ever since. The only time I stopped was to fill my gas tank. I don't know where I am. Last time I checked, it said I was in Kansas. I don't know what to do. Should I join Davis in the afterlife or try to move on? The most sickening thing is not knowing what happened. What the fuck happened, I keep asking myself. What the hell happened?
Children from all over town are going missing at the same playground. I couldn't believe it when Dad said he was taking me to the park. Usually on Dad's weekend, he just sits me on the couch and turns on Netflix. I think the only reason he fought for partial custody was to make Mom's life a little worse. "Hey Dad, want to push me on the swing?" "Sure, bud, let me talk to this couple first, then I'll push you as high as you like." Dad took out his detective's badge and hung it around his neck. "You're here for work? You're not supposed to take me to work. Mom's going to be pissed." "It'll be our little secret." Dad winked and walked away. He's always working when he shouldn't be. It's part of why Mom left him. Dad says I'm too old to cry, but I thought he wanted to play, so I couldn't help but let out a tear. Why the sad face? Some kid was sitting on the other swing. His face was painted white, and he wore a funny, multicolored suit. "Where'd you come from?" I asked. He turned and pointed to a small blue tear painted on his face. "You called for me?" the boy said, pointing to the tear on my cheek. "The name's Skippy. Skippy the Clown." "Are you here to cheer me up?" I asked, wiping away my tears. "I'm not very funny, but I can do a magic trick. Want to see?" "Sure." Skippy reached into his jacket and pulled out a green balloon and a thick black string. He blew up the balloon as giant as a bike and lassoed it with the string. When he let go of the balloon, it started to float. "Wicked," I said. "This is yours," Skippy said. "Let's tie it around your wrist so you don't lose it." Okay, I held out my wrist, happy that at least one thing went right today. Oh, and whatever you do, Skippy said, pulling the knot painfully tight. Don't scream. I put my badge back in my pocket and walked towards the playground. This couple said the same thing as the last ones. They took their child to this playground, looked away for a second, and poof, kid vanished. Who's ready to swing? I asked, but I didn't see my son. Just an empty swing rocking back and forth and a single shoe lying underneath. I examined the shoe and it's my son's all right, but where's the rest of him? Suddenly, something smashed into the ground next to me. It was my son's other shoe. I tried to see where the shoe fell from, but I could only see a group of small green dots in the sky. I pulled out my phone, pointed it at the sky, and zoomed in as far as I could. There were half a dozen of them up there, emaciated, blood dripping down their wrists and onto their clothes. But they were all smiling at the sight of their new friend. Thanks for stepping into the shadows with Mr.Scareme. If our tales gave you chills, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell icon to never miss a scare. Remember, with Mr.Scareme, fear is just a click away. Until next time, stay spooky.